Hello, everyone. So thank you very much for attending this session, which is entitled The Slave Trade's Impact on Population and Africans. I'm Nathan Nunn, Professor of Economics at Harvard University, and I'm very pleased to introduce our participants and speakers today in the session. So today we're extremely fortunate, extremely happy to have two speakers with us, Patrick Manning and Ugo Nwokegi. And our moderator today will be Jay Carr. So I'll quickly introduce them and then turn the time over to them. I'm very excited to hear what they'll have to say. So I'll first introduce Jay Carr. He's at the University of London in the SOAS group. He's a PhD candidate in history. It turns out his thesis defense is on Friday. So on Saturday, all goes well, fingers crossed, we'll be able to call him doctor. He studies ethnic groups in Sierra Leone and Liberia from the 16th to the mid 20th century. And as I mentioned, he's currently a PhD candidate in history, soon to be a doctor of history. So he'll moderate and he'll be collecting any questions that you provide through the chat. So please provide as many questions as you can to our speakers. We'll have two speakers. So the first is Dr. Patrick Manning, who's the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of World History Emeritus. And he's an intellectual giant in the study of the slave trade and African history. Since his work on Africa in particular and the slave trade, he's turned to undertaking research in the world more generally and in global history, and in particular collecting data, which is a great resource for others to use, and which he analyzes himself. One small point on Patrick is I came across his book, Slavery in African Life, when I was a graduate student in my PhD, and it was a book I've probably read it 4 times by now. It was extremely eye-opening to me. Coming from economics, we tend to think, being somewhat arrogant, that we're the only ones that do kind of rigorous quantitative research. And this was an amazingly rigorous scientific quantitative analysis, which basically created, with a huge amount of data, simulations of the demographic impacts of the slave trades in different regions on different genders within the continent. So it's an amazing book, and really for those of you that are quantitatively oriented numbers people, it's one way of looking at the slave trade and its effects. So for me, that was quite formative and had a big effect on my own research. So I'm particularly happy to be hearing from Patrick Manning today. So the second speaker is Ugo Nwokegi, who's an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, in the African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies department. And his research is also extremely exciting. What I really like about it is it really gets at the micro level and provides information about the identity of enslaved individuals during the slave trades, and really brings richness and precision to their individual stories. He's done a whole host of research looking at the oil industry, an amazingly diverse range of analysis on different topics. But for me, that's what I really connected with and have been the most impressed by. So we'll listen to both of them. We'll start with Patrick, and then we'll turn over to Ugo, and then Jay will collect questions, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So I'll turn it over to Patrick Manning.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for the introduction. And I'm very pleased to be participating in this wonderful, valuable, comprehensive course. I received my PhD in African economic history in 1969. I was the second or third person to receive such a PhD after Tony Hopkins, and about the same time as Sarah Berry. I list here my website, which has most of my publications and a lot on my current research. I also list 2 books that I've done that are relevant here, and a book in process. there. So I want to start with demography and then turn to African slave trade. I want to emphasize the importance of population data in comparative analysis and the strength of population data and vital rates for the period since 1950, thanks especially to the United Nations analysis. But for the colonial period, the data are partial, and we don't yet have really coherent data on vital rates and population. And then especially before 1890, we have no clear basis for estimating vital rates or population size or growth rate. We do require more research and certainly new methods. Yep. Okay, so I begin with this slide to reaffirm the previous point. It shows for the period after 1950, the declining birth rates, the more rapidly declining death rates, and the continuing high growth rates of Africa since 1950. Before 1950, it's a much hazier period, appearance with competing ideas as to what the real data are. So I've shown in red data on death rates, in black down at the bottom, data on population growth rates, and up at the top in brown birth rates. But the heavy dotted lines are the figures that I've used in my simulations of African population. The dotted lines are those that are taken from or else imputed from the estimates of McEvedy and Jones in their 1978 estimate of populations worldwide, which is still widely used. But the discrepancies between the two lines shown for growth and deaths are really considerable. The number of other estimates that are in between the two of them make it so that the estimates of population that one would guess for Africa at the beginning of the 17th or 18th century are really huge discrepancies. So here's another parameter in population expectational life at birth that shows much the same message. It shows expectational life at 1950 as about 35 years for the average newly born person in Africa. That's up to 65 years now and heading upward. But for the period before that, we have again the same discrepancy in views as to how long was the life of an average person in Africa. I want to note the question as to whether the mortality rates in Africa declined at a steady rate from 1800 to 1950, or whether they were stable for a long time with a rapid change at a certain point. I believe that the latter is the case, but it's even with that thesis, it's a question of determining when that transition would have taken place and whether it took place at the same or different times in different parts of Africa. With that background, I turn to the simulations that I did between 1980 and 1990, in which Nathan kindly mentioned in the introduction. So here are the two regions that had the most serious impact of the Atlantic slave trade: Luango, north of the Congo River, and Angola to the south. The heavy dark lines are the number of captives exported from each of those regions on a decennial base between 1700 and 1900. And then below that is shown the estimate of population size with two estimates, a high and low estimate from the simulation, but showing population decline. And what I really want to talk about here is the gender ratios, the adult sex ratio shown up at the top in light dotted lines. Between 1750 and 1850, the adult sex ratio in the full regions of Luanga and Angola was, according to these estimates, no more than 80 males for each 100 females, because especially of the excess in male exports as captives. But this discrepancy in adult sex ratio was even more serious in many areas and many time periods within that century-long era. Furthermore, the updates that I've done since 1900 confirm and even extend the seriousness of this discrepancy in gender ratios. But the main authorities on Central Africa have shown no interest in the idea that population decline took place during the area of the slave trade. No interest is not the best way to say it, but they did not participate in any really serious engagement with these theses. So here's the overall logic of that same simulation. The initial insight was that one begins with what is known about captive exports over time, and you link them to what one can guess about continental population. That meant setting parameters for African populations, their rates of birth and death, and then setting parameters for captives who were on the road, their rates of capture, birth, death, and migration. And then one would start with 1900 populations. I used the figures given it by colonial administrations and subsequently saw that I needed to change and increase those estimated populations, but worked back from 1900 to 1700 using a 1982 model, which calculates decennial change in African free and slave population. And then I had to link up the analyses of each decade to each other. The result was that I projected widespread population decline from 1750 to 1850, sharp gender disparities. The expanding 19th century slave population within Africa was not really accounted for in this analysis. So it's an oversimplified analysis, but nonetheless with robust analysis that I think were deserving of more discussion in the literature than they got. Now, after 1900, I revised the organization of the analysis. I revised the model with using more standard demographic analysis and conditions based on my further studies in demography. And I found that there was a need to do the analysis at an African continental level, since that was the level at which the discourse was taking place. So I identified 70 regions of coast and interior, simulating African continental populations back from 1950 to 1900, and then taking those 1900 populations and using the simulation to trace back to 1650. One other important change was I needed to do a more sophisticated job of linking each decade's analysis to the next, and we ended up with a Bayesian analysis linking variables from decade to decade. I was adding variables to the analysis, and so I had to add parameters of assumed values in order that this big matrix would have a solution. The big matrix of time and space and migration meant a lot of variables were at play. So for post-1800 continental enslavement, I set estimated high and low figures by region and by decade of continental enslavement. And then at the end of the simulation, I had to set estimates of the proportion of people enslaved within each region and have the simulation calculation populations of free and slaves that would meet those target figures. Overall, the results seem to me to convey Africa as a region of intermediate population density, not a sparsely populated population on a world scale. So to me, the statement that Africa is land abundant and labor scarce should be relativized. Comparisons of these ratios among African regions and with other world regions will show their variety and their changes over time. The statement certainly does not hold for African population today, and I'm dubious about its universality back to 1500. So I made tentative population estimates published in 2014. They're not fully confirmed yet, but I still think that the African continent had 140 million people, more or less, somewhat less in 1650 and somewhat more in 1900, that there was slow growth after 1860 and rapid growth only from someplace about 1930. Nevertheless, simulation errors emerged at the moment that I was retiring in 2016. I lost programmers and the work halted. So I would love to be able to finish up this simulation and its estimates. But for that, I'll need to find some good programmers and some funding to support it. With that, we leave the continental slave trade and turn to the Atlantic slave trade. And here we focus naturally on the slave voyages data set led by David Eltis, which has good data on over 33,000 voyages. With that, it estimates the total flow of captives, but the estimates are complex and basic and involve computing 155 specific types of situations, each with multiple cases. They include no estimates of error margin. So the estimates are widely quoted, but rarely analyzed. And I want to emphasize that the data, for all the effort in assembling it, still has substantial missing values. So in voyages across the Atlantic, 70% of the voyages give the African port of departure and the overseas port of arrival, but not the other 26%. For cargoes, 21% of the voyages list estimates of the number of people embarked. Twice that list the number of people arrived, but only 15% of the voyages give both embarkations and arrivals. So my group turned to Bayesian statistics and worked from 2014 to 2020 to estimate the missing data. The techniques and logic of this analysis is fully explained in the papers that are referenced here. I'll just give for now a simple rule of thumb that bigger groupings of data give better estimates of the missing data. I'm going to hop over the first Bayesian analysis for a lack of time and turn to the second Bayesian analysis, in which we found that the number of captives per voyage, per route, varied little in the whole period from 1650 to 1850. And so we verified this characteristic and made it into a statistical assumption for the analysis. That is, it gave us the biggest groups we could get of data for the analysis. So we ended up with 8 departure zones in Africa, 5 overseas arrival zones, and that meant a total of 40 routes. The result of the calculations gave us a 10% higher estimate of the total volume of the Atlantic slave trade than had been in the latest Eltis estimates. So I think the Bayesian 1 and Bayesian 2 analyses need to be set alongside the Eltis analysis of slave trade volume. And that pattern tells us to abandon the dream of an authorized summary of slave trade that was propagated, I think, by the Eltis group, and replace it with a situation of multiple perspectives on these big data estimates, and require that we explain the specific advantages and disadvantages of the data sets that we choose to use. So here's a look at more details on the results of Bayesian analysis 2. Here we see in cross-section the 10 largest routes, which carried 85% and more of the Atlantic captives. The other 30 routes are shown compressed into the small section of the pie up at the top. But you can see that Central Africa and the Bight of Benin together composed a substantial majority of all the slave exports, going both to the Caribbean and to Brazil. In the interpretive hypothesis, we recognize that the stability of each route's cargo size came not from the characteristics of individual voyages, but from the overall pattern of harbors, disease, nutrition, society, economy on each coast, and the weather in between. This approach to the slave routes overall has broad implications that we can start discussing. Now here's a temporal cross-section of the Bayesian analysis. The top lines are of departures from Africa in orange, and then the blue is arriving captives overseas, and down at the bottom are the numbers lost at sea in green. The heavy lines are from the Bayesian 2 analysis, and the dotted lines are from the ELTIS analysis. So the difference is not overwhelming, but the differences are substantial, and in particular, the distribution of captives among regions and across time is significantly different in the two approaches. So here I list the citation of the Dataverse archive where the papers and the data are held, and put the DOI for the introductory guide to the full data set aggregation. So now we get to economic history. And here we have two graphs, the first showing the total value of export slave trade from Africa, giving it the three main regions of slave trade, and then the total value of slave trade up at top. The value peaked at 4 million pounds in 1913 pounds sterling per year in the late 18th century. And then one can see over in the right that in the commodities aside from slaves, that they reached the level of export slave trade in 1850s and then bypassed slaves in subsequent trade. With regard to the decline in the value of slave exports as seen in the left-hand graph, it's of course because of the decline in the number of slaves exports, but it's also worth emphasizing that the prices of slaves declined in the 19th century, and that accounts for a significant portion of the decline in export value. Well, let's go back to Africa and look at 19th century enslavement. The second slavery has been used as a term in the last couple of decades for the flourishing capitalistic slavery of Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. But at the same time, this was the peak of enslavement in Africa and in Southeast Asia. So two questions. One, were the latter slave populations part of a capitalist world economy? Short answer is yes and no. And does the aggregate of all of these systems of slavery on three continents count as a global second slavery? And I think the answer is surely yes, and that it sets a framework for some valuable future research. Africa in the mid-19th century had the largest enslaved population anywhere ever. And to add a couple short points, thinking about yesterday's discussion, I believe that the total number of slave exports from Africa from 1800 to 1850 was larger than the number of exports from 1750 to 1800, and larger than the number of slave exports in any other 50-year period. Second, I think that the number of people enslaved on the African continent in the mid-19th century was over half the enslaved population any place on the world. This raises questions about the substantial transformations in the African social order as seen through slavery from century to century. Okay, well, back to the 19th century. I proposed dividing up the regional slave systems within Africa in the 19th century into those that are clearly tied to the international commercial economy. So one can start with West African oil palm trade. That's where I started. And then Senegambian peanuts, Zanzibari cloves are examples there. But on the other hand, one must consider the cases where people were in slavery for elite service to monarchs or to landowners. And this is in inland areas, but also in coastal areas. And I've listed a number of the major states and regions where this was the case. So this is discussed in a bit more detail in my chapter in this volume on the Atlantic and Africa, the second slavery. There are also many other valuable articles addressing this question of the large scale of 19th century continental African slavery. And the next stage of the same discussion is the decline in slavery and the question of peasantization. If there were 10 to 20 million people enslaved in Africa as late as 1880, an unknown portion of them escaped slavery or renegotiated their terms of slavery in the half century thereafter. How many were able to get title to land or steady usage of land? Is it millions? Here we are now in a position, I think, to do comparative work to post-slavery instances of peasantization in the Americas. So for Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba, Brazil, the US, there have been analyses in some detail, and the results of those analyses are quite varied. Venezuela and Colombia are additional important cases. And we should add to these studies of Burma and Thailand, where slave populations rose rapidly and then declined, and where there followed expansion of rice exports from that and other areas of Southeast Asia. So for Africa, this means considering the correlation of slave escape to export growth for the cases of oil palm products, of cocoa, of peanut exports, of cotton and other commodities and other regions. This is the concluding slide here, and in it I offer a couple of questions and a couple of suggestions. What have been the systemic changes in African demography since 1800? 1800 is an arbitrary time, but a good place to start from. When were the shifts in vital rates, in migration, in growth, and indeed in social structure? So those questions analyzed along with studies of GDP per capita and so forth will give us a lot to do in African economic history. For individual researchers, I recommend that pre-1950 statistics on African populations and per capita variables be systematically accompanied by statements of tolerances and error margins, that the individual researchers not be left with the full responsibility on this, but that the field of African economic history should create an institutional structure to publish revised populations and per capita statistics and error margins in recurring updates to make it so that we are using the latest data and are clear on the dependability of the data until we get a good sense of African demographic past. There we are. Let's see. There. Got myself out. Did I leave myself out altogether? I did. Well, I can stop right there. It's been terrific to explore these issues with you. Nathan?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Pat. That was an amazing presentation and super informative, and it was great to see all of your research put together in one presentation. So I'm sure I know we have a lot of questions, and we'll get to those, but we'll turn the floor over to Hugo.
Thank you very much, Nathan. Let me get my screen shared. Okay. Good evening, all, and good morning from California. My what I'm going to speak on today, basically what I call slave traffic and culture in Africa. I have to apologize in advance for those of you who expected me to take on a topic that addresses development or economics in a direct way. In fact, I would have had I have had a lot of things I could work on. I wasn't given any particular terms of reference, so I chose to do something that came to my mind. But what I can say is that I will be willing to answer any questions related to what I am discussing, even if it is coming from economic angle. I'll give it my goal. If not, Pat is here. Okay, here's outline of what I'm going to do. After the introduction, I'm going to talk about African and European conceptions of slavery. And then I talk about slavery in Africa. And then the slave traffic. That traffic, all about the traffic, both internal and Atlantic. Okay, and I will also touch upon the trans-Saharan trade because all of them intersect and played an interesting role interacting with each other and had a host of economic and social and cultural consequences in Africa. Yeah, and then I wrap it up with the effects of the slave trade as a whole. Okay. Slavery, I see here, is an economic practice as well as social practice. Okay, I mentioned right here economic and social, and cultural practice. But historical studies in Africa have often, I would say, wrongly treated slavery, slavery and human trafficking as a purely economic practice, as purely economic practices. I'll show you why. The cultural basis of slavery, and what I'm saying here is not only about Africa. I think this applies to almost every society in the world that practices slavery. Even in plantation America, where economic production was, unquestionably the basis for slavery, but it had a lot of cultural undertones. Okay, and that cultural basis of slavery is the reason slavery came to assume cross-cultural element, that cross-cultural element of dishonor. That's, you have it in every society. Some elements of slavery exist here or there in the world, but everywhere slavery was that, slaves were treated mildly. There's that element of dishonor that comes with it. Okay. And another reason why this cultural element is important, when the Enlightenment thinkers in Europe started talking against the slave trade and slavery, they actually, in the main, provided a cultural argument. We're too civilized to hold people in there, and the people should not be held in this condition. They were not making an economic argument. It was Adam Smith. Adam Smith, was the one who led the economic argument, but that wasn't the main thing. But even then, with his, in his economic analysis, he said slavery was unproductive because it was on free labor. That on free labor is, on free labor cannot be productive. And he gave many reasons for that, many cogent reasons for that. Therefore, cultural identity is shaped and was shaped by the slave trade, slavery, even anti-slavery, both in the other parts of the world and in Africa. While this position underscores slavery's, the cultural basis of slavery, I do not mean in any way to detract from the economic basis of slavery. Not in any, nobody should understand me to be saying that. Okay. Another point I want to make in connection with the cultural basis of slavery, particularly in Africa, is that I choose to title this presentation and all uses of, well, as much as I can, a reference to the transaction in human beings as trafficking. And somebody will say, what's the difference between trafficking and trade? Trade is actually a specific term. Trafficking allows for a variety of transactions, sometimes that are not done for economic gain, which is what actually trade means. Trade is about economic transaction, but not every transaction is necessarily economic. And trafficking, using trafficking instead of trading, allows us to give us some latitude in understanding, the exchange, transactions over human beings in Africa during the slave trade era. So the starting point in this discussion, of course, is slavery, because without slavery, there won't be trafficking in human beings. Okay, so any discussion about the slave trade needs to proceed from, understanding slavery itself, because it was because of slaves, the existence of slavery, that then human beings are being, exchanged. Okay, so and here we find differences in conceptions, conceptions of slavery between Europe and Africa. And I would say that David Eltis, wrote a book on this whole topic, okay? The Rise of African Slavery in the Americas, and made a very good point about the transformation that had happened in European conception of slavery. When at the time that the Atlantic slavery was starting, that the Europeans themselves had stopped enslaving fellow Europeans. Not that they didn't enslave fellow Europeans, they did before, but they had stopped doing it at the time that the transatlantic slave trade started. So they then turned to Africans instead of Europeans, which is a very, very important contribution that has not always basically doesn't seem to stick, but I think it is very fundamental. And that is to say that the enslavement of Africans by Europeans was essentially, a question of culture and identity, because Eltis argues convincingly that it was easier to use European labor, but Europeans wouldn't do it because they wouldn't enslave fellow Europeans. It was not easier, or not only easier, but it was much cheaper to use European labor. But they went out of their way to go to Africa at great cost, because according to according to Eltis, before 1780, before 1680, every good that was transported transatlantically, every good that 3/4 of the cost of that good, of when you buy it, say something produced in Europe and you buy it in New York, and if you paid $100, it means that actually $75 of that was accounted for by transportation cost alone. So that places this this cultural element in perspective, okay? But Europeans, still went to Africa, added another leg of the journey. At the time, transportation was extremely costly, and went to Africa to get captives in order to sell to Europe. So anyway, and another element, that is different. That's the failure to enslave Europeans. Fellow Europeans, that is failure to enslave insiders, but enslave others. That idea did not exist in Africa. That idea did not exist in Africa because Europeans that were coming were people from that post-Renaissance and in the main during the Enlightenment, and they had already separated themselves from enslaved fellow Europeans. But in Africa, the idea was still different. So if Europeans went out of their way to avoid enslaving fellow Europeans to the extent of killing them, maiming them, and all that, but they wouldn't enslave them. But Africans went out of their way to enslave fellow Africans. Africans still enslave fellow Africans, let's put it this way. And sometimes when they enslaved fellow Africans was not always for economic reason. Was not always for economic benefit. For example, the king of Ouidah during the 1720s, just before eventually Dahomey conquered, Ouidah, the king of Ouidah threatened that he would, if a war came, he would capture the Dahomeyan king as a slave to do the vilest offices. Okay, so he would capture this guy and make him a slave. He wasn't talking about killing him, but making him a slave. It also means that this dishonor, enslavement, was actually to deny this guy of dignity, rather than actually the productivity that will come out of enslaving him. Okay, so it's not about productivity. It's not about economics. It was about dishonor. Again, in Dahomey itself, when a new prince assumes office as king, which usually came after a bitter succession dispute between princes, and each prince in leading the dispute had supporters from within the royal house. Then eventually the prince that a match winner will round up the losing princes, okay, and sell them. Not only sell them, put them on the ship and make sure that they're taken to the Americas to dishonor them, to have them enslaved. Now, it's not about the money that the new king of Dahomey would gain from selling those people. So economic gain was not the motivation. Okay, come on, listen, sorry. Okay. But at the same time, the Atlantic traffic provided corrupt authorities in Africa to basically give them opportunities for pecuniary gain by corrupting offices in order to sell people for money. So this economics still exists. People, there is a lot of economics about that, but what I was saying that there's a lot of the cultural element. And the culture too was a determinant of who was enslaved. Okay, I analyzed this particular issue in my book, Slave Trade and Culture in the Battle of Biafra. Who was enslaved? How payment was made in the transaction, and even how the proceeds, some of the proceeds from the sale of captives were applied. But who was enslaved is that basically, these people, first of all, some people were enslaved because they were captured. Some people fell into slavery because they committed a crime. Some people fell into slavery because they were, they were victims of war. They were captured in war, and so on and so forth. And some people fell into slavery because they owed a debt and they couldn't pay a creditor. If the creditor was mean, then they would take them and sell them. And it was usually fair game. So so Africans saw themselves, okay, and then how payment was made. Joe Miller, God bless him, the late Joe Miller now. Joe Miller did a good job of this on the Angolan coast. He described how the payment was conducted. The payment was made in a specific assortment of goods. A specific assortment of goods. Those goods must come together to pay for captives. They wouldn't accept any payment, even if you pay them only one aspect of that, one of the items in the assortment, but give them the quantities of that item that would cost more, that was worth more than the combination. They wouldn't still take it. It must come in that combination. So this is very striking. And these elements need to be understood and analyzed. And then what about the proceeds? Of course, most of the proceeds were used. People use them, just as people will use money they got, there for spending or for investment or whatever. But there were cases, and in some categories of captives, and in some societies, who then, after they are sold, the proceeds from that sale was not spent. Okay, for example, among the Ibibio in southeastern Nigeria, when a person committed an abomination, or some kind of sacrilege, and they were sold as a punishment, then the money received, they will receive money like, at least this was in the 19th century, if you received money like manilas or anything they used to pay for people at that time, they would bury it, under a banana tree, okay, instead of spending that money. So these aspects of the slave trade need to be understood. I know that as students, scholars of business and development, you would have expected me to talk about something that speaks to those disciplines in a direct manner. But I chose to speak in this in order to pique your interest, and so that it will be up to you to know how you utilize and apply these issues. And again, Africans saw themselves as belonging to their respective communities. Because people often wonder, why did Africans sell fellow Africans? And in essence, when you really think of it and consider a lot of things, the question is unwittingly Eurocentric. And they say that Africans, they don't see themselves as Africans in the way Europeans saw themselves as Europeans. But that's not even the main issue, because this is actually to acknowledge that the question is even valid. It's not, because the prohibition of enslaving only outsiders was a European thing, not really Africans. But people always fit it into Africa and try to analyze, oh, this king invaded another in order to enslave them, the communities. Of course, that happened. You know, people from those first societies enslaved other people from other society. But people were enslaving people from their society always, both legally and illegally. So the legal and judicial systems had, and juror systems had regular, institutionalized way of producing captives from within. Okay, so and that was, that was more or less in every society in Atlantic Africa. So of course, a great many raiding was illegal, but clandestine and clandestine and unstructured. Okay, but people indulging them, did not follow the rules, but there were people who followed the rules, and also insider enslavement prohibition does not appear to be commonplace. Was not commonplace in Africa. So apparently, instance of such prohibition can be misleading. For example, Robert Baum, his work on the Isulalu in the Senegambia, in actually just showing that a lot of people did not generally enslave fellow Isulalu. But then he informs us from the same work that the Isulalu, however, allowed people who were struggling to sell their children into enslavement. And when you can sell your children, that's as inside as anything you can think of. Not even people from the society, but your own family. So that people need to understand all of this. So instead, Atlantic Africans generally regulated the enslavement of insiders. Yes, they regulated it, they did not generally prohibit it. And only in ways different from the way they regulated the enslavement of Africans. And then I can finish talking about this issue about the relationship between culture and the slave trade. We are talking about gender, in which also basically I've made some contributions to. It's also in that book, Slave Trade and Culture, and there has been an article, 2001 article, the the African conceptions of gender and the slave traffic, that addresses this issue. And this emphasizes this cultural element. Basically, 2 out of, only 1 in 3 Africans, okay, no, sorry, 2 out of every 3 Africans sent into the slave trade were male, okay? And there is a reason for this. And Africanist historians have explained that the reason, cogently, the reason lies in the trans-Saharan slave trade. Because trans-Saharan slave trade existed before the transatlantic slave trade, during the transatlantic slave trade, and after this transatlantic slave trade era. So the demand from the trans-Saharan trade, basically, which was focused on females, primarily, took away some of the female that Africans could offer to the market. And therefore, there were not too many females to, to give to the American, to offer to the American market. Secondly, that African, work regimes in African, that women did the bulk of agricultural labor, which was true. And therefore, African societies could not offer too many of them. And but when you see these reasons which are clear, then you dare ask, why is it then that a region like Senegambia sent, out of every four captive they sent overseas, only one was female. But when you go to the Bight of Biafra, it was basically like 45% to 55%, much closer to parity. And you see these differences across the board, but the difference between the Senegambia and the Bight of Biafra is the most dramatic, because the Senegambia sent the highest number, proportion of females, proportion of the least proportion of female, and the Bight of Biafra sent the highest proportion of females. So you see then that in the Bight of Biafra, some of these explanations given to Africa as a whole, which are cogent in themselves, did not really explain this, what happened in the Bight of Biafra. The trans-Saharan trade that was touted as, one of the major reasons there were few, relatively few females offered to the transatlantic trade was not the issue, because the trans-Saharan trade did not actually touch that region. And this is really interesting because it raises a number of issues. It's not that that region had not traded, participated in the trade across the Sahara, but during those centuries of the slave trade, that relationship did not exist. So, of course, I have hypotheses on that, but that is by the way. Then, when it comes to female level in the region, in the Bight of Biafra, women were very important in agriculture, but also men were more than other regions in Africa. So, and men, not only that men were important, the women probably produced more, but men were deemed culturally, were perceived to be more central to agriculture than women. In that region, crops were allocated on the basis of gender. Okay, yam, kola nuts were allocated to males. But most other goods, women could plant. So why was this so that even that women cultivated most other goods, but the yam was regarded as the king of crops? Yam was so important to the spiritual and the culinary life of the region that every important occasion, ritual, and every yam had to be there. And kola nut was the basis of everything, including welcoming people to your household. So these goods were reserved for males. So that region, could offer to send, they could not offer as many males as other regions to the transatlantic trade. And the same thing happened with domestic slavery. Okay, in those regions where females were central to agriculture, more women were enslaved. But in the Bight of Biafra, the enslavement of women, at least in the inland region, was almost, I didn't find strong evidence of the enslavement of women. A woman, can only have a woman as a slave. A woman you get as a slave will invariably end up as your wife, or your children's wife, or your slave's wife. But to hold a woman as a woman slave, such an institution did not quite, there was no social space. I didn't find any social space for that. So these are the issues, and there are other issues I can talk about on that. So I hope this helps because the reason Africanist scholars started making, looking into this issue about the gender structure of the slave trade is that Americanists who started studying the slave trade long before historians of Africa got into it had argued that it was because the Euro-American planters in the Americas demanded for males. And that was why then Africa, supplied that. Because slave trade was always seen as demand and supply. So, but Africanists say no. It was not just because the Americanists, Euro-American planters wanted captives, but also because this is what happened in Africa. It was the African social processes, social and economic processes that produced the gender structure of the slave trade, which was also cogent. And I have to say that Americanists did not invent, they did not just invent the idea that Euro-American planters wanted males. That was actually what they wanted. That was what they expressed. And that was what ship owners, that was, you see that in the instruction that European ship owners gave to their captains when going to the African coast. You have to buy all males because they want males in the Americas. But then they end up getting more females than they wanted. And another question, because, but another thing is that these Europeans, when those African women were coming to the Americas and were very productive in the plantation system, proving themselves even in field level, yet the Euro-Americans continued to demand for males. So you can see that the conception of gender is driven. The demand was driven by the conception of gender that was fixed. The Europeans assumed that women were soft. They couldn't do much work. But African women basically were different. And the Africans saw women in a different way. And Europeans saw women in a different way. So you can see how preconceptions that are cultural shape economic outcomes. Okay. And why, this is some of the reasons I find it difficult to continue to call, slave trade, but rather the slave traffic. Okay. But I want to end this discussion just by going through some of the effects of the slave trade. Some of them are, most of them are well known, and part will be dozing of me talking about this, but it may be interesting for some other people. And I'm just to round up, I'll just go through this, but I will be so willing to answer questions, about these issues, okay? So there are effects of the slave trade. I tried to categorize them between economic, political, social, cultural, but it's difficult, demographic, because they are all interlinked. So you find one effect, it has both social, it has social, economic, and cultural, implications. So it's difficult to do, but I would just try. So, so thinking about the economic and demographic, effects, of course, the slave trade was, extremely destabilizing. And destabilization is incompatible with economic progress. Apart from the disruption of life, that daily life, slave raiding, sometimes wars, but all wars, as John Thornton rightly pointed out, in Africa was not caused by the slave trade, even during that time, because Africans had also other reasons to war against themselves, okay? But what happened that invariably the people who were captured in those wars ended into the slave trade. So, but the destabilization was just too much to allow for, a stability that would lead to, and then there's imported manufactured goods, because while the slave trade was going from the particularly from the second half of the 18th century, when Europeans started industrializing, starting from Britain, which was a major slave trader. Then more and more cheap manufactured goods, started coming into Africa. And these goods like, of course, guns had been coming a long time, but now through industrialization, they were producing better guns and more quantities, and other products, hindered economic, basically domestic industries, okay? Because gunsmiths and all of that who were making, and so many other things, which Walter Rodney did a good job of analyzing in his work. How Europe underdeveloped Africa. And then talking about demographic effect, John Thornton basically did what I would call come up with an interesting idea. Pointed it out, it makes sense, talking about the dependency ratio. The unfavorable dependency ratio in Africa during the slave trade, that is where the non-productive sections of the population became top heavy, okay? When you have a population where many of them are either disabled or too old or too young to work, then there's a problem, because that section of the population who have to work have a lot of burden on them to take care of the other portion of the population that are not working. And in the slave trade era, this was a lot of those African regions that suffered the slave trade, because the slave trade went for the able-bodied people of working age, okay? So that dependence ratio, of course, had direct economic consequence of raising the burden on the working population, but it also resulted in skewing basically gender division of labor, okay, and also transformations in family structures. In terms of gender division of labor, for example, Africans, because fewer men were left behind, and men specialized, for example, in hunting and providing protein food for the population. But here, either the absence of men, only few men, women would either go into hunting, or the society, would forfeit much of their protein for the food. And if women should do men's work, then it will be at the expense of the work that females, women traditionally did. So that was really, really a major destabilizing impact, because you cannot quantify the impact of the slave trade. That's can only scratch it.
Thank you very much, professors, for this very informative lecture on this very important subject. If I could please make two quick observations before we start the Q&A. We have some very good questions, some very energetic questions. First, for Patrick, your approach as a historian, your approach using quantitative research was very enlightening, and it shows the importance of interdisciplinary research and specialization. And for Hugo, I'd like to say your cultural basis of slavery as a reason to assume cultural element of dishonor is also a very, I would say, kind of a novel topic, a novel way of looking at the issue. And if I could go into my first question, which I'll ask Patrick, which segues into my observation, and this is from Itu Melang. It says interesting data triangulation, Patrick. Did you at any point use census records in the US or countries where enslaved Africans were sold? Do any of these countries in Europe or over in the US have population inclusive census records dating back to the era of the slave trade? And I yield.
Thank you. Let's see, can you hear me now? Very good.
Yes, I can.
All right, thank you for that that question. So the idea of using data from the diaspora to help confirm and add detail to the analysis of the departure of population from Africa, that idea makes a lot of sense, and it fits with the sort of global organization one can make of the operation of the slave trade. So for actual censuses, they weren't taken in large number early enough to be of use for the slave trade, but there were for Brazilian plantations and West Indian plantations, substantial demographic data collected. So Stanley Engerman led in summarizing a lot of British Caribbean data to give you ideas on the gender ratios within the New World population and the birth and death rates of slaves in the New World. The honest answer is I wasn't able to use enough of those data to fill in all the details, but that's the strategy of this work in the long run. The simulation projects numbers of people who would land in the Americas and how many of them would survive, and then how many, the question how many are slave and free is a different one, but the analysis of the experience of slaves in the Americas or in Europe is really helpful in understanding the flows back and forth from Africa. Can I make one small point? I saw from 2 or 3 questions what was meant by the term lost at sea, and that really means people who died in the transatlantic crossing.
Excellent. Well, you answered the other question I had for you. That was for the lost at sea.
Oh, sorry.
So you beat me to the punch there. If I can please go to you, Ugo. Based on your statement, the cultural basis of slavery is the reason slavery came to assume cross-cultural element of this honor. There are several questions on this, and I've linked 2 together, one from Tawo and KK. And the question basically is, why is it important to view the slave trade not on the basis of economic benefit, but as dishonor? Can you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Thank you. So you say why was why was dishonor important in the slave trade, right?
Correct. Why did you emphasize dishonor over the economic benefit? That's their question.
That's interesting. You see, I don't really seek to emphasize over economic. I'm also saying that, what struck me is that after looking at slavery cross-culturally, everywhere and in different times, there is a specific, there is some cultural element, and dishonor is something that tends to be central to that. But there are other elements that made slavery cultural. The perception of slavery and all of that. So the dishonor is what I saw to be central to all of that. I don't know why it was so, but for me, it is something that links, something that pertains to all slave systems that I know of. Even where people overcame slavery after the first generation, but when they were, at least when they were slaves, there was this dishonor and being relegated. Even if they stayed in the family as members of the family, there's elements and some practices where that dishonor was applied to them. So that was the point I was making. I don't know if it is clear.
No, thank you very much, sir. Okay, the next question I'll pose to both of you, and this is for Nathaniel. It's a little bit off, but if you could, how would you give a brief comparative analysis of the trans-Saharan slave trade versus the transatlantic slave trade? I know it's a little off, but just wanted to get that out there. You could both take your time and answer.
Yeah. Pat, do you want to go?
Okay, I'll keep it short. The trans-Saharan slave trade was smaller than the transatlantic slave trade, but it was longer, so it included a large number of people over a long period of time. I want to reaffirm Ugo's argument that the trans-Saharan slave trade was dominantly in females, whereas the transatlantic slave trade was dominantly in males. There are interesting areas like the north of Nigeria or Senegambia where people went in slavery in both directions. But I think that there is a rather larger proportion of the population of North Africa that is of sub-Saharan African descent that was brought there in slavery. They're all Arabs now and so forth, but the impact of the trans-Saharan slave trade in North Africa, including Egypt, is significant. Thank you.
Good. I have, basically nothing more to add to that, and also in consideration of the time. So, but if I may, early on, I saw a question from Kainde Aluko, and that is, why was polygyny, was slave trade responsible for polygyny in Lagos? It's not only for Lagos. When you see, for example, the slave trade relied mostly on men, the Atlantic slave trade. So the population left behind was female heavy. Okay, so there were a lot of women, which itself, of course, in itself stimulated polygyny, but that was not the primary reason for polygyny. Men did not necessarily marry because there were too many women, but also because to increase the labor pool, in their household, the household level. So the number of wives determined the amount of food you could produce, and the size of your band, and therefore the size of wealth. So and so on especially in the 19th century, when the slave trade the Atlantic slave trade began to lessen, and there was a need to produce more goods, humans, that's producing commodities for export, export that fetch a lot of money. So polygyny grew a lot in that time. Also when there were, basically the slave trade was still going on, especially in Lagos, places like Lagos and Angola, where the slave trade lasted long because of the role of the Portuguese traders, who were very active in those regions. Because the Brazilians, because long after the slave trade was abolished, in the case of Britain, 1807, and then effective 1808, and then France and Portugal and some other European countries were actually made by Britain to stop the slave trade after 1815, following the Congress of Vienna, where the British insisted on that. And then they began to abolish the slave trade. But the Brazilians were not part of that. And by then they had become independent from Portugal. And they were very active in these two regions that I mentioned. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask another question. And it was asked during Hugo's presentation, but I guess both of you could address this. And it's Hittites says, how did slavery affect languages? What are the effects of slavery in terms of linguistics?
Okay, I can. What I can say is, because the slave trade, basically, and slavery in Africa stimulated the movement of people, mostly by force and also through trade. Okay, and trade was an important vehicle for language, because as John Vincent has taught us, there are the words we use in language has one. Every word has one of three origins. Either we inherited it, or we borrowed it, or we invented it. And then when it comes to this, borrowing is an important aspect. And also people need that language to thread together. Of course, without this slave trade, they would have done it, but the involvement of human beings increased interaction. So, and therefore languages evolve as people sought to communicate with each other. That's one. Second, the number of people coming is because some African societies had a lot of captives coming into their society. And those people were coming in, some of them as wives, okay, who ended up as wives, then they influenced, in the languages of the societies they came from. Okay, have, kind of caused these languages to evolve. They may not become totally new languages, but they evolve through, the words and stuff. It's because some of those people in Africa brought, particular institutions from their homeland, such as deities that everybody in the society, subscribe to. Because Africans, this religious thing, Africans were, their religion was additive, okay? Their religion was not exclusive like Christianity or Islam, either my highway either my way or the highway. But those religions were tolerant. So even enslaved people, the deities they came with were subscribed to people if they believed that those deities were important. And these aspects, increase the impact on the languages of the regions. And finally, when it comes to pidgin, the emergence of pidgin English, I think this slave trade has a lot to do with it. Again, such a language would have evolved even without the slave trade. As long as there was trade, there would have been a communication language. The pidgin English arose as a result of the need to communicate with Europeans and to communicate with other Africans, because pidgin English has English words dominantly, but it has also Portuguese, has Dutch, and then it has a lot of vocabulary from various indigenous languages. So these are aspects of it. As I said, languages would have developed, but because of the volume of trade and volume of activity, the slave trade enhanced that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just would add that I agree that the study of language and using it to explain slavery, or slavery and language to explain each other, is really worth lots of attention. Thanks.
So I think we're out of time. We'll end now. So thanks so much for Jay, Ugo, and Patrick. If there's any last thoughts or comments, otherwise, thank you so much. Everyone found it completely stimulating, as I did. And you can tell that from the number of questions, comments, and from the feedback we have in the chat. And so we'll say goodbye to everyone, and we'll see you at our next session. So thanks again for everyone for participating. So it was really, really, really fascinating. Wish we could have gone on for longer. So bye.